Okay, so we'll start now. Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for coming to this event. This discussion is hosted by the Alexander Hamilton Society at the University of Michigan, a chapter of a nonpartisan, not-for-profit national organization that seeks to identify, educate, and launch young men and women into foreign policy and national security careers imbued with the Hamiltonian perspective of strong and principled American leadership in global affairs. We believe that the United States has a special moral responsibility to play in the world and hold very true to the belief that the United States ought to stay actively engaged in international affairs in order to advance international institutions, democracy, and free enterprise. We're joined here today by our renowned guests, Dr. Jeffrey Gedmin, as well as our moderator, Professor Greta Willing from the International Institute, specializing in international migration, forced displacement, Ukraine, and the war in Donbass. Dr. Jeffrey Gedmin is a co-founder with Francis Fukuyama of The American Purpose, a nonpartisan international multi-platform media venture dedicated to the defense of liberal democracy. Dr. Gedmin served as the CEO and editor-in-chief of the London-based Legatum Institute, the Aspen Institute in Berlin, Radio Free Europe / Radio Liberty, headquartered in Prague. Before assignments in Europe, Dr. Gedmin spent 10 years at the American Enterprise Institute in Washington, D.C. At AEI, he was a resident scholar and executive director of the New Atlantic Initiative. Dr. Gedmin is the author of The Hidden Hand, Gorbachev and the Collapse of East Germany. He served as the co-executive producer for two major PBS documentaries, The Germans' Portrait of a New Nation, as well as others. He's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and serves on several boards, including the Institute for State Effectiveness, the Justice for Journalists Foundation, the Paris-based Tocqueville Conversations, and Radio Free Europe, and Radio Liberty. And he is also, together with former U.S. Ambassador to the Czech Republic, Norm Eisen, Dr. Gedmin is the co-chair of the Transatlantic Democracy Working Group. Please welcome our speakers here today, and I shall yield the floor to Dr. Willing.
Thank you so much. The world has really been struggling to understand the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And I think that very innovative thinking will be required to find a path away from war and also to respond to the humanitarian needs that have arisen in an effective way. And so events like this one are crucially important for identifying solutions and effective ways to think about the conflict. I'm just going to make a few points before I cede the floor to Dr. Gedmin. The point that I want to make is a historical one. So over the last 3 weeks, we've become accustomed to hearing about the Russian invasion of Ukraine in terms of the number of days. It's important to remember that Russia invaded and occupied Crimea in 2014, and this act of aggression was widely condemned but never really adequately addressed. And so from a Ukrainian perspective, at least, the current predicament really began 8 long years ago. And I think that longer historical perspective helps us understand what's going on now. The second point I want to make is just really how much is at stake. So we've been hearing on the news about catastrophic loss of innocent civilian lives. We've heard about the territorial integrity of Ukraine as a nation. It's also important to think in terms of the ability of Europe to respond in both a principled and a sustained way. The Council of the European Union has made this unprecedented step of giving all Ukrainians visa-free access within Europe. But the question is really, it's unprecedented, but is it sustainable, right? How do we make these efforts sustainable for what's now approximately 3 million refugees in Europe? I think the war makes the shortcomings of international institutions that were created precisely to prevent such events from happening that much more clear, and I hope that you in this room will be very active participants in the reform of those institutions. And then finally, I'm very concerned that it's relationships that will be the uncounted dead, right? Relationships as the uncounted casualties of the war as it becomes more difficult for Russians and Ukrainians to speak to one another, as people on different political sides can't find a way to communicate. And so the important thing is dialogue, and what I understand about your organization is that dialogue is crucial, and so that is definitely a primary concern on my part. And then I want to just make my third and final point is, there's an opportunity that I would like to think is hidden in the rubble. And that opportunity is a chance to come to a new appreciation of Ukraine as a country and the Ukrainian people. And this means debunking some of those toxic myths that, Ukraine is the same as Russia, or Ukrainians are all this or all that. Because we have an opportunity to appreciate Ukraine as a sovereign and independent country with immense human and natural resources that has firmly embraced values like freedom and democracy and rule of law. And I think that if we come to this new appreciation, it really will pave the way to being less surprised at Ukrainian resilience, right? That's another prominent theme in the news, is the surprise that Ukrainians have fought back and come together to resist this invasion. And actually what we're seeing is completely consistent with my findings from 2015 to 17, when I was based in Ukraine and interviewing people who had been internally displaced back then, from the hedgehogs, right, those barriers blocking roads, to the Molotov cocktails. All of that is consistent with dynamics that we really began witnessing with the invasion and occupation of Crimea in 2014. All of this has tremendous potential and implications for how we understand war, how we understand conflict, and how we respond to it. So thank you, and I look forward to hearing from Dr. Gedmin.
Okay, so thank you, Professor Yuling and Will and all of you for welcoming me here. I'm from Washington, D.C. I arrived today. It's a privilege to be with you. And as I hear you speak, Greta, if I may, I do feel like I'm at home. I've been reading you and admiring what you do, and I'm interested in sharing thoughts with you, but hearing your views, because I have no idea what's on your minds, but I'm very, very curious. I find myself these days feeling sometimes combative and sometimes pensive, so brace yourselves. We'll see what reveals itself. I have a friend, I'll start here, named Veronica, who is in her 30s, early 30s. She's from Ukraine. She has a 9-year-old son named Lev. I know them from here and I know them from there. She's a PhD, not in anthropology, but political science, working in Washington, D.C. for an NGO. And guess what? she was at home in Ukraine for a visit in Kyiv at a time when many of the best experts were saying, he's surrounding the country, but he won't invade the country, okay? And there she was with Lev, 9-year-old Lev, and then the war came, and they found or got their way to Lviv in the west and wanted to get to Warsaw, but couldn't get a flight and couldn't rent a car. And by the time they got to that border, there were streams of people. You've seen them on television. I think you know some of them, perhaps, you know, friends or fellow students. And so they went south and they got into Romania. Veronica sent me an email, I mean, we'll come back to this, that said, we're safe. We're in a NATO country. That's important. We'll come back to that. Romania, 4 nights ago, she managed to get her mother out with their dog into Romania, first one city, now in Bucharest, and her father is back north of Kyiv. Her father is, I guess, I've met him in Washington, actually, and I met him in Ukraine, mid-50s, and he's taken his civil defense training and will fight. This is mind-boggling to me. He's not of an age and not of training, and he's going to fight with a gun, you know, against, I don't have to tell you, planes and tanks and artillery. This is a subject, as you can tell, just like your professor here, the subject I feel personally and professionally very close to. Just a scene set. During the war in Syria, which was a horror, as you know, in 2 years, there were 2.5 million refugees. Devastating. In Ukraine, in 3 weeks, there have been 3 million refugees. To get your head around that, that's more than 3 times the population of Washington, D.C., or to get your head around that, if I looked it up and Googled correctly, the population of Ann Arbor is about 330 or 340,000. I was reading an interview with Professor Yuling last week where you said, I believe, that at that stage, around March 9th, there were an estimated 7 million internally displaced people. It's more now, and it's more every day. This is devastating. For me personally and professionally, I've spent 12 of the last 21 years living and working in Europe, in London and Berlin and Prague. I've traveled through Eastern Europe. I've been in Ukraine. I've been in Russia a number of times. I was president of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, and I sit on the board now of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, where we are actively, daily, hourly, trying to get people out. We started months ago, hope for the best, plan for the worst, but we have people, journalists, technicians, producers, editors in Russia and Ukraine, in different parts of Ukraine, who are trapped now. Some don't want to leave. They're there with parents, you know, or siblings who can't get out. And some do want to get out, but they're trapped. And as I said to Will or one of the colleagues earlier, I can't even believe my own language when I say they're trapped behind enemy lines. That sounds like some sort of movie. You know, trapped behind enemy lines. They're trapped behind enemy lines. And we're trying hard to get them out. A footnote to that, they're journalists, most of them. And all parts of the Ukrainian population are vulnerable. But imagine if you're identified as working for a US congressionally funded media outlet, you're exceptionally vulnerable, and some are believed to be on kill lists. It's mind-boggling, but it's real. Pardon me. Let me organize my reflections for you in 2 parts. Both parts will be relatively brief because we're here for you and the discussion with you and your questions and your comments. But the two parts are these. First, how did we get here? And second, how do we get out of here? I think those are, for me, fundamental questions. How did we get here is important because I think, I warn you, I have a point of view. But we'll argue about it if you want, but I have a point of view. How did we get here is important because roots and sources of conflicts must be understood, and history is important, and context matters. Let me start with that before we go to how do we get out of here? How do we tackle this horrendous problem? I'm going to do this in bullet form. There's a 4-hour version with a slide deck and all that. I'm going to do this succinctly in bullet form for you. 1989, November 9th, 1989, the Berlin Wall comes down, and within 2 years, Soviet-imposed communism in Eastern Europe is gone, and the Soviet Union itself dissolves. And what happens in the 1990s? You have about 150 million people across Eastern Europe, from the Baltics to the Balkans, who in the main, overwhelming majority, want to join Western institutions of cooperation, notably the European Union, which is a symbol of prosperity, economic integration, opportunity, and NATO, which is a collective defense organization. And it was clear from the get-go, from the 1990s, that very, very many people of Central and Eastern Europe who during the Cold War found themselves on the wrong side of the Iron Curtain wanted a security guarantee, a hedge, an insurance policy. If Russia one day returned again to aggressive behavior or imperialistic ambition, we want to be inside this security organization so that we feel defended properly. In those days, in the 1990s, Russia didn't love that. Russia didn't always oppose it adamantly. There was even a moment where Boris Yeltsin, the president of Russia, said to Lech Walesa, the president of Poland, "I acknowledge a country has the right to choose its own alliances." Maybe begrudgingly, but it was acknowledged. And then in those days, NATO tried to do all these things to hug Russia, include Russia, be transparent with Russia, be collaborative with Russia, so that it was understood that this was integrating democracies, but the organization NATO was a defensive organization. It was not a threat to Russia. Then what happened 22 years ago? Vladimir Putin became the leader of Russia, and as you know, it didn't take long. There are a number of things that happened. It didn't take long. He was filled with nostalgia. He said that the breakup of the USSR was a great geostrategic disaster of the 20th century, and he started picking and pushing and testing the resolve and the sovereignty and the independence of nations across Central and Eastern Europe into the Caucasus and beyond that were leaning west, and he thought he should pull them back east. And you know there was an invasion of Georgia in 2008 with territories annexed. And as our esteemed professor said, this is not the first invasion of Ukraine. In 2014, there was an invasion of Ukraine and an annexation of Crimea. And there are other things. There's a massive cyber attack on Estonia. There were meddlings in elections in Europe and in the United States. There was interference in the Brexit debate in Britain, and so on and so forth. So then suddenly we got to this current moment. No one really knows. I don't really understand exactly why this moment. There are those theorists who say, well, NATO and NATO enlargement was so provocative. he really didn't have a choice. It was just self-defense. I mean, he couldn't sleep. He was walking the Kremlin at night. He was so anxious because of this big threat of Ukraine belonging to NATO. So I just tell you and remind you, NATO accession wasn't on the agenda this year. And if you had asked me 2 months ago, Jeff Gedmin, when will Ukraine join NATO? I would have said to you, well, between 10 years and never. But it's not happening soon. It wasn't on the political agenda in Washington or in Berlin or in Brussels. But somehow now he chose this. I have my theories, and I think one credible theory is that he looked at the United States and the West, and he saw that we were weak, preoccupied, polarized, divided, arguing about infrastructure bills, great power competition with China, all important, by the way. And he said, now, okay? That's my theory, but I don't know. But he did. So now my second basket, if you will, if that's how we got here, broadly, in bullet form, how do we get out of here? How do we tackle the problem? I think there's still a history to be learned from. And I think you, Greta, alluded to this. Ukraine has been at war since 2014, okay? And the Ukrainians have been asking us for weapons for self-defense since 2014. And we'd give a little bit, but not too much, you know? And sometimes, but not too much. Because we said to ourselves, the Americans and the Europeans, we said, we hear their anxiety and we want to be helpful, but do you remember, we don't want to provoke Russia. If we give them too much, it will provoke Vladimir Putin. And I know it sounds so simple-minded, but here we are, you invited simple-minded Jeff Gedmin to discuss this with you this evening. Vladimir Putin is not wired that way. He's not wired like you and me. And I think it's very hard for the modern Western mind to understand someone whose hardwiring is so fundamentally different. And I think he is an individual for whom weakness is provocative. Okay? Weakness, that's the mindset of the predator. Doesn't that sound simplistic? But that's the mindset of the predator. Let me tell you, right before the pandemic, I was in Helsinki, and I had a meeting with, and I interviewed the president of Finland. Finland, neutral, dovish, you know, you've heard of Finlandization. And I tell you what the president of Finland told me on the record, so 2.5 years ago. He said, you Americans don't understand Vladimir Putin. We have a history. We have a border of 800 miles. And here's what the president of Finland said to me on the record. He said, Vladimir Putin, whom I've known for years, he said, understands one thing, that's strength. And then he said, and I quote, he said, you have to understand, if the furniture in the room is not nailed down, he will steal it. Folksy, charming, but devastating. So we made our mistakes, and now here we are, and now Vladimir Putin is inside. Here's what I'll close with on the what to do and how do we get out of it. The front end for me is pretty clear. For me, it's unprovoked aggression. It's a violation of the UN Charter that prohibits transborder aggression and recognizes the inherent right of self-defense of member nations. This is a larger state and a smaller state and a big military against a power unmanned and undermanned and ungunned. To me, there's a clear and compelling case of aggressor and victim. On the back end now, what to do about it, it is fiendishly difficult. You know, there's an ongoing debate about a no-fly zone. And I'll tell you my own view. I was asked to sign a letter last week in favor of a no-fly zone, and I chose not to. I feel conflicted about that. That's where I am today. You can ask me where I am tomorrow, okay? But that's where I am today. It's my own view that we want to avoid a direct confrontation between Americans and Russians that could lead to a wider war or, God forbid, a conflict with nuclear weapons. However, that's where I am today. Ask me tomorrow. I'm conflicted. I've just told you that. However, I think the United States ought to realize, and I think a step today was President Zelensky's address to the Congress and the administration's response. We're fighting a war. It's a proxy war. We fought proxy wars during the Cold War, but we are fighting a war. And in that context, I would give the Ukrainians anything and everything they need in economic aid and vital humanitarian assistance. There can't be enough. And protection of citizens, unarmed, and refugees abroad. And I would do everything we can to help them with military assistance because they need weapons, real weapons. You know, we give them javelins, we give them stingers, we give them a lot, we're giving them more, but they are outgunned and they're brave and they're getting killed and their civilian population is getting shelled. I would give them whatever they want. You may have seen that there's a controversy recently about Poland offering its MiGs, its fighter jets, and the United States resisting that. I would have given them, you know. And if Zelensky asked for 1,000 toasters, I'd give him 5,000 toasters. And I'd throw in microwaves and whatever else, can openers and screwdrivers. I think that the situation is so urgent and so dire, they will fight. But I think we Americans, I'll speak for my circle and my world, and I'm so heartened by the solidarity internationally and across the country, but we shouldn't get too caught up in rhetoric and virtue signaling. I think it would be devastating if, in reality, we decided we would fight for Ukraine down to the last Ukrainian. They're on the line. We're not on the line. Final thought, story, connection. I think this is about Ukraine. I think it's about Eastern Europe. I think it's about Europe. I think it's about world order. I think a lot, you know, let's see, 3 weeks, Jeff Gedmin conjecturing, let's see. But I believe it's one of those bigger moments. I was watching television. You see all these images. I was watching television the other night, maybe CNN, and there was this young woman who turned up at the Hauptbahnhof in Berlin, where I lived for 5 years, running the Aspen Institute. I know that train station very well. And she was probably about 20 years old, I guess. And she was being interviewed in this big hallway where they're passing out sandwiches and bottles of water to refugees arriving into the Berlin station. And the reporter says, "Who are you? How did you get here?" And she says, "A month ago, I was a student. And now I'm in Berlin, where I don't know anybody, where I don't speak the language." She said, "I don't have any money with me." And she said, "I'm homeless." And I look at her and I think I know her. I don't know if that makes sense to you, but it's me, it's you, You think there's a big distance between us and her? Life doesn't work that way, trust me. Life is far more fragile than you think and far more unpredictable than you can imagine. And so I just leave you with this thought that I believe we have a responsibility. I believe the world has a responsibility. And God help us if Vladimir Putin wins and Ukraine at the end lies in ruins with refugees in the millions, with internally displaced people in the millions, that will not just end as a Ukraine problem, which is horrid enough. So anyway, my thoughts, eager for your questions and eager for our conversation with Professor Yuling at the podium. So thank you. There you go. Was that too pensive or was that too combative? Just there you are. So Will, how do you want to moderate, or Greta, how do you want to moderate this conversation?
Yeah, sure. So I'll start off with a few questions, and then we'll open up to the audience for additional ones. So my first question would be, what are the lessons that NATO can draw from avoiding and essentially defending against Putin's salami tactic strategies that they've employed, such as in Transnistria and Moldova, or South Ossetia and Abkhazia and Georgia, and how can NATO avoid triggering Article 5 by granting them membership, and how can we avoid something like this from happening in the future with those two countries?
So Moldova was one, and what was the other? Georgia. So these are hard questions, and I'm not for everybody, all times, all places, join NATO, let's indiscriminately extend NATO's and the United States security guarantee, because it's not practical. It requires public support. It involves sacrifice and risk. So I'm not a global indiscriminate interventionist, including with NATO. Moldova is very complicated. Moldova is not joining NATO anytime soon for a variety of reasons. There are lots of sub-Article 5 things one can do for economic integration and security assurance. Security assurance in that neighborhood doesn't get you so far, but assurance, we can talk about that later. And in the case of Georgia, I had dinner on Sunday night with a Georgian journalist who said, Will, maybe it's exaggeration for effect, but I think there's a kernel of truth. She said to me, you have to understand that if Vladimir Putin wins in Ukraine and dominates this country in some way, that everything you all have been doing in Georgia for the last 30 years is gone. It's dead, it's finished. Civil society and NGOs and media and Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty and university, it's gone, because he will be on our door next, at a minimum to make sure that the governments, plural, in Tbilisi are pro-Russian, pro-Moscow. There are problems in Georgia anyway with economic development and corruption, and we've already lost parts of the country. But I think to answer your question, someone in this audience is not going to like this answer. The road to security for the smaller nations of Eastern Europe doesn't lie in Tbilisi or wherever else. It lies in Moscow. And ultimately, we need a Russian strategy. And it's going to take a long time, by the way. But we need a Russian strategy to support the Russian people so that the Russian people have better, more decent, more accountable government. And a government, they may not love America, they may not love NATO, but a government that is not revanchist and intent on restoring empire through imperial conquest and war. So I don't have any short-term solutions. Those two countries not joining NATO this year, next, and we've got to fix the conflict in Ukraine first.
So just the second question, and I'll leave it to the audience. So recently there's been a move that was canceled to transfer Soviet equipments by NATO countries such as Poland when it comes to MiG-29s. And as you know, a lot of NATO countries in the Eastern Bloc have a lot of these Soviet equipments that they've been meaning to get rid of for a while. And the Ukrainian Air Force is more equipped and trained to operate those fighter jets as well. Would you say that this is an opportunity to transfer them? And given that this deal fell apart, how would we sort of try to circumvent this logistical failure that recently happened?
So there's hard defense, and there's public diplomacy, and there's politics and all this. I told you that I think it was a mistake, as I do understand. Tony Blinken, Secretary Blinken, the State Department, favored accepting the Polish fighter jets, the MiGs. We don't have them. Ukrainians are trained in them. Some of the East Europeans have them. By the way, Egypt has them. They have about 200 of them. I don't know if we're knocking on that door or not. Second largest recipient of U.S. aid in the world. But Will, the short answer to the question is there are technical, operational, and process issues involved where some, including my closest friends, say, well, because of the reconfiguration, it doesn't mean that a Ukrainian pilot can step into the cockpit and operate that fighter jet tomorrow. That may be. I think it was politically very important to find a way to say yes. The Ukrainians wanted them. Like I told you, they want toasters, give them toasters. Okay? They're fighting for their lives, okay? And they're dying by the day. They wanted them. And the Poles, I'm given to understand, initially didn't want to part with them. Part of their national defense. And they give them up. Here's what that says to me. Poland is thinking, give them to Ukraine. We could be next. Now. So the military dimension is one thing I can't attest because I'm not a defense expert, but the politics are as such that those kinds of things need to be made possible. Now, the Germans opposed that, one last note to that, on the grounds, and so did Borrell, the EU did, on the grounds that it would be seen by the Russians as escalatory. I think we're past that. Have you noticed there's fighting and it's fierce and we're giving them all sorts of other things? I understand conflicted, the no-fly zone troops. I understand that. But short of that, I don't understand the analysis of javelins, yes, mix, no, drones, yes, this one, no. I think that gives way too much agency to Vladimir Putin, who has already told us it's all escalatory. He's told us that sanctions are an act of war. So I think we should listen to the Ukrainians, the partners in the region, and do what we know is best.
Now we're going to start collecting questions from the audience. Raphael, can someone, this mic. Raphael.
During both the Gulf War and also the situation with Libya's nuclear, I can't remember exactly what.
It's okay.
With Libya's weapons, we saw cases where, when faced with initial setbacks, authoritarian states had the opportunity to either back down from the West or continue pushing. And in the Gulf War, we saw that after Saddam's disaster in Kuwait, he ended up backing down and then he ended up backing down from the situation. Afterwards, the U.S. leveled sanctions on Iraq, which gradually crippled the economy. I heard a similar argument with Russia in that Russia's costs are fixed in this war, while their marginal cost for continuing combat is far less than the West, because every day that there's millions of refugees in Europe, and every day that the West has to send weapons to Ukraine to continue the fight as Ukraine's defense industry is being bombed out into oblivion, that Russia feels that they should continue the war as long as possible because it's not going to get that much worse for them. So in light of the fact that Russia's costs are fixed, do you think the U.S. should offer Putin a way out of this crisis? And if not, do you think there's an alternative?
Well, I have my way out. I don't think Vladimir Putin's going to accept it. So we're all speculating, and we all, in Washington and here, I suppose, and everywhere, we play this game of being inside Vladimir Putin's head, and so I'll speculate with you. I will tell you, I hosted, in the 10 days before the war began, in Zoom discussions, I hosted Phil Breedlove, retired 4-star Air Force general, former commander of SACEUR, European commander forces. And then in a separate conversation, I hosted Ben Hodges, retired general commander of the U.S. Army in Europe. These are individuals with deep knowledge and deep expertise in military affairs and in this part of the world. And both said separately in small Zoom discussions I hosted We don't think he's going to launch an attack on Ukraine. We think he's trying to collapse the government and collapse the economy, but we don't think he needs to invade the country, and we don't see a full-on invasion as likely. Now, I'm not criticizing them. What I'm actually saying is, with all that depth of knowledge and experience, they didn't judge that correctly, and we were really very close. So guess what? I can be really wrong. I can be way wrong. But let me take a stab. There's so much we don't know. I think concerns about a wider war with Russia are well-founded. I don't think any of us want that. It could be drastic. It could be even calamitous, catastrophic. So I'm not glib about that. I just want to put that out there for you. Second of all, as I've said, I don't think that can constrain us entirely either, because if we reach the point in our history where nuclear weapons in the hands of tyrants are the trump card, think of what that world looks like in your world in the next 10, 20, 30 years for South Korea, for Taiwan, for Japan, for the rest of Eastern Europe. If the Iranian mullahs were to obtain nuclear weapons, and they seem to be on that path. So each and every time a larger predatory state wants to take a larger state and they say, we have nukes, oh, well, okay. Gosh, we wish we could stop you. So it's supposed to be taken very seriously, but it can't be simply the final trump card. We dealt with this conundrum during the Cold War, and it was bloody difficult and involved dilemmas. But we were on the hook for the defense of West Berlin during the Cold War. If you know your history, West Berlin is like that. It's like 2 million people. And it was in the heart of communist East Germany, surrounded. But we pledged to defend West Berlin. And we defended it, actually. And West Berliners remember that to this day. So to get to your question, what comes next, and can we offer him an off-ramp? I don't see an off-ramp for him. I am very hardline about this. If there's an off-ramp, I want reparations. It's going to take years and billions to rebuild this country only after 3 weeks. Wait for 3 months. The shelling, you watch it, so I won't be dramatic and detailed to, there's a theater that collapsed today. There's a school that was bombed yesterday. We don't know how many kids, different cities, Mariupol is under siege. And anyway, on and on and on. I don't see, to answer your question, a compelling off-ramp. And if there were one, I don't know how we would get him to keep going or comply, because he's not a credible partner. He's not an actor in good faith. That sounds dramatic and emotional, but this is not a business partner who's behaved badly, This is a real culprit who is the face of some sort of evil. Gosh, doesn't that sound, crazy evil? So anyway, I don't know what happens next. I want to give as much military assistance and economic aid and humanitarian assistance to Ukraine and the refugees as humanly possible. And I personally think that he has to be defeated. What does defeat look like? I think he has to be pushed out of Western Ukraine. I don't know if we can push him out of the Donbass and that part of East Ukraine, but I think he has to be pushed out of West Ukraine. I think Kyiv has to be defended. I think Zelensky has to stay alive. How do we get from here to there? I don't know, but the Ukrainians will fight for a very long time.
This is specifically about the Russian state. the Russian state has been defeated since the Cold War, specifically in the First Chechen War. Do you know what factors led Russia to pull out during the First Chechen War? Strategically, what calculus they made before deciding that they couldn't stay here any longer, assuming such things could apply to Ukraine?
So no, but the tactics they use in this war, as you probably know, they used in Chechnya and in Syria. They do target civilian populations. And of course, it emerged that in Chechnya, they had a pro-Russian leader, Kadyrov, who is a very ruthless fellow who does the bidding of Moscow. So I suppose the original thought, I mean, who cares what I think? But here's what I'm thinking. The original thought was, it won't be that hard. We'll get Kyiv. We'll kill Zelensky. We'll put our own guy in, and then we'll manage it. We'll stay in parts, or we'll stay in whole. So I suppose somehow mirroring that. So I would like to ask you, Greta, if I may, because we need to involve you in this conversation too. From your work, and you have a book coming out in the fall on Ukraine, from your work on the humanitarian perspective, what are the things that we should know that we're not seeing on cable television, web, and reading in the usual suspect places? And then in particular, I find it utterly horrifying. There are 10 things, 100 things that are horrifying, but there are reports coming out that human traffickers are active and exploiting the opportunity with refugees. Can you give us a little assessment of, through that lens, what's happening, what's likely to happen, and is our response anywhere close to adequate so far?
Yeah, I would be happy to. And just to backtrack a little bit first about why now, right? Why was this big surprise? Why did the invasion occur on February 24th of 2022? One of the theories is that it is a round date for Vladimir Putin, who of course deplores the disintegration of the Soviet Union, and of course the Soviet Union coalesced in 22, right after the Civil War was over. So one theory is that it was a beautiful round date, and I also agree 100% with your assessment about the perceiving weakness on the side of Western powers in the United States in particular. I think on the score of NATO, I think what can we do about NATO? How can we rethink this? I think that there's really the first rule of a successful humanitarian operation is to distinguish between the combatants and the non-combatants, the humanitarians, right, and the victims. And that's, I think that you spoke about the fall of the Berlin Wall, and I think that NATO suffered an identity crisis at that time, where it tried to reframe itself as a defensive organization, as a humanitarian organization, and I don't think Russian Federation was ever on board with that, right? They were just never on board with that identity shift for NATO, and I think that addressing that fundamental perceptual problem is really crucial. And then with regard to the humanitarian situation, I think that there's a lot of vulnerabilities. We don't actually know exactly how many internally displaced people there are because, of course, they haven't really begun registering. They haven't been counted yet. Many people shelter in place or shelter with relatives. It's enormous. I think that we're only beginning to understand how best to help people with trauma. And I would suggest that we look for trauma in unlikely places. So you mentioned human trafficking. That's certainly important. Traffickers do prey on anyone who's vulnerable and anyone who's migrating, whether that's children or others. Another area of trauma that we might not initially anticipate is that not all of us can kill. Ukrainian men are being asked to pick up guns. And they're being asked to pick up guns and kill, potentially, without being trained or prepared. And that is profoundly, in my personal experience of, speaking to civilians who rose to the defense of their country in 2014, 15, 16, 17, it's profoundly destructive to the human psyche to be asked to kill and not be trained to do so, right? This should be the job of trained soldiers. So there's a lot of areas of trauma. And then to send it back to you, I think that, you spoke earlier about hard and soft defense. And I was hoping that you could speak a little bit more about soft defense as it pertains to Russian citizens in particular. I'm really concerned about all of the hate speech that is taking place towards Russians that may be actually supportive of Ukrainian territorial sovereignty and things of that nature. So how do we manage the soft diplomacy side of things with the people in Russian Federation?
Right. So these are great questions for which I don't have good or simple answers. I think that we need to differentiate. Russia's 145 million people. It's a large, complex federation. Yesterday, I hosted a Zoom discussion with a journalist from Kazan, which is in Tatarstan, which is 12 hours east of Moscow by train, someone who is fiercely anti-war and anti-Putin. I think, to Professor Yuling's question, we have to find ways to differentiate. And in a policy sense, I think we want to find ways to support those who are, I'm going to watch my language carefully, they don't have to be like us. They don't have to be like me. More pluralistic minded, more tolerance oriented. They don't have to be, we have our own problems with our own democracy here, with rule of law and so forth. But there's a constituency in Russia that is not all about the regime of this ex-KGB man, Vladimir Putin. How do we reach them? How do we support them? How do we extend empathy? How do we listen to them, learn them? It's going to be really hard because he's closing the media space. And of course, I don't know if we have good numbers, but apparently thousands have been arrested, and you see it on television. Young people, elderly people in Moscow and elsewhere who are not part of this. So I think it's a mistake, as you inferred, to criminalize the entire population. Hate speech is always a mistake. I've never seen the case for hate speech. And we have to differentiate. And we have to isolate the culprits who drive this, who finance this, who sponsor this and dictate this. They have to be undermined. I hope they can be exited eventually. So, what else is on your minds? Who's next?
That gentleman.
We'll do the calling. And I should have asked you who you are. And the first gentleman, could you tell me who you are and what you're studying?
I'm Raphael. Undecided but probably going to
Okay, thank you, Raphael. And you are?
My name is Alexy, and I'm actually from Ukraine.
Okay.
So I want to make some comments. And I'm a PhD student here in chemistry third year, and my whole family now in Kharkiv. and still there because they have no option to leave the city. So I'm quite worried about this situation because our city is like on the front line and they are under constant bombardment. I guess after Mariupol, it's like the most dangerous place in Ukraine right now.
Yeah.
So I have like some questions to you. Probably, maybe will be speaking really politely because, I'm from Ukraine and I'm kind of affected by this situation. But I want to make some comments about previously said about the civilian people who are given guns and asked to fight. It's a slightly different situation because they are willing to do that. They are not asked to do. It's not a obligatory thing that, okay, we are mobilize all men and we give them gun and send them to fight. They are asking to give them a weapon to fight for their country, for their homes. There's like a lot of calls from my people in city, so that they're asking my local mayor in my city why we are not providing guns. We are willing to defend our city alongside with the actual army, but we don't have them. Like for capitals, they distribute like 30,000 guns to the population. And I don't know, like there's like a lot of things saying like hate speech against Russian and so on, blaming them for this aggression. I personally don't blame any Russian who's staying in the US. I have a lot of friends from Russia who like really supportive and so on. But I'm feeling that I'm have a right at least to speak and blame the Russians who stay in the country for this situation because Putin is their president. They elected them, this government and president. If they elected, they're responsible for his actions. If they not elected and the elections was falsified, it's also their fault why you're not protest against this. If you are not protesting and you're not voted, that's probably you're okay. Or what's other thing about this? Yeah, this like kind of remarks, but I would like to ask like a couple of questions. First of all, you said about that probably like Putin was some kind of like provoked or by the weak response from the West. In my opinion, and what we've seen right now in Ukraine, it's probably is another thing that probably he was disinformed by his advisors, because according to the forces that he collected on the border, like 150,000 troops, it's barely not enough for doing a full-scale war in Ukraine. So probably he was less informed that okay, the Ukrainian army is weak, and so on. And he didn't expect any fierce resistance as he has in Crimea. And by this mean, how we can speak to the person who is actually living in vacuum. He didn't read the news. He actually receives information from the papers that his advisors and ministers give him. And in any totalitarian regime, actually like these advisors are really like fear him and doesn't want to disappoint him, saying, you are not right. And in such state, he has actually become building his own world perspective, how we can make any diplomatic relations with the person who is living in another dimension. And second thing, I don't know, like I feel like very weak NATO response. Actually, it's even more like response from like Great Britain personally, not from NATO. When is NATO like commanders and Pentagon advisors also was misinformed about the Russian state, about the state of the Russian army, because before the war, like nobody was actually thinking that okay, the Russian army is the second army in the world, but as we'll see in Ukraine, it's much far from the true. It's like much less professional, much purely equipment. I guess it's like I would say it was referred to the Chechen war, so it's still on the same level as what we see. I have a doubt that they don't use their modern equipment.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, thank you. I'll just take one piece of that. I appreciate all of that. We didn't assess and take this threat seriously enough. If we had, we would have for years provided Ukraine adequate capabilities for self-defense. And we didn't. Would that have meant that he would not have attacked? Who knows? But surely it would have reduced the probability significantly, number one. Number two, on his Putin's being disinformed and miscalculated, I suspect you're undoubtedly right. And you made a comment about how intelligence works inside dictatorships. At the end of the Cold War in communist East Germany, the East German authorities there were no independent polls, and so the East German communist leaders didn't see the popular protests coming. And in part because the Stasi, the secret police, they had their internal polling because they could go around factory floors and universities and students and listen to people and ask people, and they're reporting up to Eric Honecker and others, everybody's happy. Of course, that's because everybody lies, because everybody knows that their conversations are being overheard and that their movements are being surveilled. So I think you're spot on that Vladimir Putin likely had bad information, miscalculated, was being told what they thought he wanted to hear, and he surely misunderstood and miscalculated on the extent and intensity of Ukrainian resistance. And he probably thought, well, the US will throw some sanctions. That's what they do. And we got the Europeans covered because they'll divide, and the Germans will say, we don't do weapons. And look at Europe. Look at the world, actually. Look at the Swedes and the Finns and the Swiss. I don't think that was part of his planning at all. So who else and what else? One way, there you go.
Hello. I have a short remark about a previous question, and then I have my own question. So my remark about responsibility of Russia.
Can you also tell us who you are, please?
Yeah, my name is Olga Grushko. I work here at the University of Michigan, and I'm a Russian citizen, and I live in the United States for 20 years already. So I left a different country, and now I find my country in this state, as is. So yes, people are responsible for actions of their president, who they elected in democratic regime, but Russia is not democracy, and Putin wasn't elected in a legit democratic election. So in such a societies, when a personal vote doesn't mean as much as a democratic society. So therefore, the responsibility also is not equal as in a democratic society of each person for the action of their leader. So this is like, and what I know in Russia is a huge, strong movement against Putin, even under circumstances of like strong political repression. A lot of oppositioners have been pushed out of the country. Nobody sits and just waits. Everybody's forming horizontal networks and try to help each other, and now try to help Ukrainians to win this war. Yes, so, and we actually get to know each other very well since last year, since Alexy Navalny poisoning, and it caused huge uprising in Russian community worldwide. And we all got together and we stay connected, and now we are joining this fight with Ukrainians, try to help everyone. So it's not too hard to find us. We're right here, so standing by your side. So this is, I guess it's more a remark than a question. But my question is, we are organizing a rally in Lansing this Sunday, and would you be like to join the speakers in this rally? So it's going to be in front of Michigan State Capitol at 2 p.m. on Sunday, March 20th, this weekend.
So thank you, and we'll get the literature, and Professor Yuling will get the literature. But So, whoops, excuse me, we'll circulate that, and thank you, and thank you for the
Thank
comments.
you.
No, they're deeply appreciated, deeply appreciated. Who else and what else? Yes, sir, all the way at the back.
Hi, Professor Gedmin. I'm Jia Hao. I'm China citizen right now, and I have a question about how Ukrainian crisis will affect China, how it leads to. One argument says that the de-dollarization will affect the dollar hegemony in currently, for example, like Russia used the petrol trade with China to try to alienate dollar. This is one argument. Also, another argument is that the Ukrainian crisis will make China lose face in front of Western countries. So how do you evaluate these two arguments and which side you are?
So I'm not sure how I evaluate those two. Thank you, by the way. Well, let me pick a spot. I told you I have clear points of view. So I think this has been a moment. This is potentially a moment. I mean, Ukraine first. So can we be clear about that? It's not about us. You know, it's not about theories and orders and unions and all that. Ukraine first. We have to protect and defend and help people of Ukraine defend themselves. And it's ghastly what's happening every day. And also, I think it's potentially a very big moment in world affairs because the solidarity, I'm getting to China, the solidarity worldwide has taken me by surprise. You know, I mean, you can find things every single day. You probably saw Airbnb, people have booked 60,000 nights in Ukraine as a way to donate. I live in Northwest Washington, D.C., and I occasionally go around the corner to this restaurant, Irish restaurant, pub. 20% of all proceeds go to help a humanitarian organization. There are dozens and dozens, and it's from all countries. 2 weeks ago, the ambassador of Guatemala, I like Guatemala, I've been to Guatemala, withdrew their ambassador from Moscow. The moral, the political, the economic, the diplomatic, the spiritual solidarity has been enormous. And I think it could be, it won't solve all our problems, but if we can help support and save Ukraine, God bless Ukraine, it will have a tremendous reverberating effect across international organizations. And I think, you spoke as a Russian who lives here for 20 years. I speak as an American who learned a lot more about me, about freedom in Eastern Europe than I ever did here, because I grew up kind of spoiled here and kind of complacent, and I still feel very privileged. But I think it's an awakening. It focuses the mind on what's really important. I complain a lot less. Do you know that these days? I slept for 2 hours last night and I flew here. I'm the luckiest guy. We're safe, We're privileged. Where am I going with this? China is a disappointment and a bewilderment to me. The Communist Party of China, that it hedges, that it doesn't join this global outcrying of support for Ukraine and condemnation of Russian aggression. It's disappointing to me because it's an opportunity for this Chinese government to show that it wants to be a responsible stakeholder in the world community and sees equities beyond narrowly defined national interest. Where does that leave us? And I don't believe, people say, someone said to me the other day, well, someone quarreling with me at the University of Wisconsin down the street where you used to live, Professor Yuling, well, Jeff Gedmin, Dr. Gedmin, there are always two sides to every story. And I said, yeah, but they're not all morally equivalent, I mean, if I were a reporter in 1943 in Germany or Poland, and I'm interviewing Jews being taken to Auschwitz, I don't say, I got to give the Nazis equal time, okay? because there's another point of view here, and we just have to make sure we hear it. No. So with China, I worry about the way China's positioned itself. I hope the Communist Party will consider repositioning itself with virtually the rest of the world. And you didn't ask, but I'm saying I worry about signals sent, because I want an Indo-Pacific region that is liberal, peaceful, oriented to open trade, takes the legitimate interests into account of the Chinese people, because it's a great nation and an immensely important civilization. But I say to the Communist Party of China, like I say to Vladimir Putin, we don't owe these regimes spheres of influence. It doesn't work that way. Not my view, not my vision of, we don't owe anybody spheres of influence by military conquest. If this goes badly, it's a human catastrophe for Ukraine and the region. But if it goes badly, I wonder how regional allies like Japan and South Korea and Australia and others think about their neighborhood going forward. And I worry about lessons drawn by the Communist Party. Not exactly what you asked, but that's what I wanted to say. What else? Watching your time, want to get others in.
Yeah, because of time, I think it will be the last question for the day.
Sure.
Hi, I'm Connor Bagby. I study business. I'm in my junior year. Would you mind describing some of your experiences with the Council on Foreign Relations? Maybe tell a story.
Connor?
Yeah.
Why do you want to know about the Council on Foreign Relations?
Well, I guess I'm interested in kind of how people who are positioned in such a way that they can make decisions might, I guess, share outlooks and their beliefs on things.
Okay, so fair enough. I'm going to not answer that, but I'm going to explain why. So the Council on Foreign Relations is an international organization. It's been around for decades. A lot of people from different walks of life in the international relations field are members of the Council on Foreign Relations. They do lots of conferences. They do lots of publications. There are many former and retired U.S. diplomats and officials involved. And you can see their website, and it's very good work, and it's important work, and it's a halfway house or interplay between government, academia, civil society, and it's an important organization. But let me answer the question that you didn't ask, okay? Let me just say a word about my former company, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. I still sit on the board because I just want to tell you this. And Connor, be interested, please, because it's more interesting. Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, old-fashioned name. Everybody says, well, radio. What? So it's an iconic brand from the Cold War. The name has remained, but it's a modern multimedia company. It has television and web and social media and video and, you know, all the trimmings and tricks and gadgets and so forth. It is headquartered in Prague. It's funded by U.S. taxpayers. It's about $120 million a year. And people say to me, gosh, that's a lot. I say, that's not a lot. It reaches 25 million people around the world. $120 million is 4 Apache helicopters, okay? It's about half the budget of PBS in New York. And guess what? If you don't know much about it, it's because they don't operate in English. They operate in Ukrainian and Russian, Armenian, Dari, Pashto, Farsi, Georgian, and so forth. It is it's, you know, being the president of that organization, it sounds trivial to say like a kid in a candy store, but if you're ever in Prague, send me an email. I will get you a tour with the president of the organization, current, okay? You walk down the hallway and it's like cold water in your face. You go into the snack bar or the cafeteria. All the journalists you see, the editors, the producers, the technicians, they're coming from the countries. They're not, you know, they're embedded? No, they're, you know, members of Congress would say to me, Dr. Gedmin, you know, do your journalists in Afghanistan ever talk to the Taliban? I say, Senator, they grew up with the Taliban. They drink tea every day with the Taliban. They're in Kabul and all 34 provinces. They know more than the CIA knows about the Taliban. You walk through the corridor, you see why I'm excited about that and not the Council on Foreign Relations. You walk through the hallways and you chat up some young woman or some young man and you say, where are you from? Well, I'm part of the Iranian, the Persian service. I'm the deputy web editor, you know, and I manage our correspondence secretly, clandestinely in Iran, but then in Baku and Yerevan, Istanbul, Dubai, around Iran. And I'll say, well, what's your story? And invariably the story comes something like this, times dozens and hundreds. Oh, no, I'm just a guy. I'm just a 26-year-old guy, and I'm the deputy web editor. And I said, well, tell me about, tell me, this is your world. It's not my world. It's Professor Yuling's world. She's, as you heard and know, she's been in Ukraine multiple times across the country, in every nook and cranny. So a young guy could be from another country, but, the young fellow will say to you, or a woman will say, well, I was a journalist in Iran, and I got arrested for my reporting, and I was sentenced to 9 years in prison, but I only did two. Have you ever been to prison? I've never been to prison. I only did 2. Prison in Iran, and then I got out, and then I wanted to leave the country, but I was blocked, and I couldn't get a visa, and my family was surveilled, and so I finally escaped across the border, and I ended up in Paris applying for asylum. That took a while. I drove a taxi. I couldn't really make a living there. And then I found my way to Prague, and you all hired me. I mean, that's a story. That's risk. That's, like you said, the Russians who are risking, it's, we go out and protest tonight. No one disappears in the night. No one has their family threatened. RFEL journalists right now in Moscow are threatened. The intelligence services threaten their families, and they make good on it. Okay? I've got one person there who's been poisoned twice. No kidding. You don't get poisoned here. Lots of bad things happen here, not this. So anyway, that was a digression. CFR is great. RFERL. If you're ever in Prague or any of the bureaus in 24 countries, tell me, tell Will, I will facilitate a VIP tour for you. I have one last question. I know we're out of time, but I wanted to go back to Professor Yuling for a moment. You said yourself, I read an interview with you about the situation, humanitarian, last week in Ukraine. If you're advising, and you may well be, U.S. policymakers at the White House and the State Department, we all know that funding is necessary. We all know that awareness is necessary. But what do we actually want from the administration, the Congress, on the humanitarian front, considering refugees, and then also to combat human traffickers who now exploit this misery? Maybe it's unfair to ask, but what's your one-pager to the president or one-pager to the Congress saying, in this front, this is the to-do list for the next 90 days or a quarter or half a year?
Yeah, thank you for that. I guess the first thing that I want to say is that Radio Free Europe is my #1 news source. I listen to Krim Reality and Radio Svoboda. I have the apps on my phone, and I love it as a news source because it's fresh, it's from the region, it's so valuable, and that's my pitch, to diversify your news sources and listen to everything you possibly can and triangulate whenever and wherever possible.
We coordinated this right before. I just want to say that was well done. I provided the segue, and that was perfect.
Yeah, so on the humanitarian front, I think that there will be massive humanitarian needs both within Ukraine and supporting Europe to support the Ukrainians who have already left. And those are two very different categories of people who will have very different needs. And so the responses have to be tailored first and foremost to those different needs. Really one of the trickiest things at this particular moment in time is the issue of humanitarian corridors, right? They've been used pretty much all over the world with this idea that perhaps you can provide people, we can get people out. But the history and the track record of humanitarian corridors is not good. They tend to become targets of military strikes. And so really the crucial strategy question with regard to responding to the people inside Ukraine is how to access them. So we have an access problem that needs to be addressed. That's the first problem. The second problem is coordination. There are many grassroots, very valuable efforts. There are also UN, multilateral and international organizations who are struggling to coordinate. And the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs should always be consulted, and people should be careful about who they donate to, because we don't want the aid to fall into the wrong hands. One of the problems with humanitarian corridors is that humanitarian aid is often siphoned off, absconded with, and ultimately used to fuel the aggressor, right? We don't want the humanitarian assistance that we give to Ukraine to fall into the hands of Russian military and thereby strengthen their invasion. So that would be a crucial key point. So access and coordination.
Thank you. Will, thank you.
Thank you so much for talk today. So please do a round of applause. And yeah, thank you. And for Dr. Welling as well.
Well, thank you all. You're busy, you have classes and jobs and all that. Thanks for making time.